what you've just heard is the opening of indie crossover artist Efterklang's Pyramida concert, the introduction to it from their 2012 Pyramida tour. So Efterklang are a band, a Danish band, formed in 2001 with three core members: Kasper Clausen, Mads Brouwer, and Rasmus Strålberg. Efterklang in Danish means reverberation or aftersound, and they occupy a unique niche in the crossover artist genre. Described officially as indie-tronica crossover, their music is heavily progressive with extensive use of orchestra, contemporary orchestration, and an original blend of pop and classical. So, Efterklang have had 4 studio albums. They've been active from 2001 until 2012. They're still around, they just haven't written anything new since then. And the Pyramida concert, the title of their album, the album which I will be talking about, was a 2012 tour they did for their album Pyramida. Like I said, it's the 4th studio album by Efterklang, and is released to very, very mixed reviews. And the band were inspired by an abandoned island near the North Pole, taking source sounds and their experience which they had there. And on this live tour, it features full orchestra, choir, backing singers, their indie trio, their band, and electronics. So, I'll begin by looking at some critical reviews. Efterklang and the Northern Symphonia at Bridgewater Hall, Manchester, got 3 stars by The Guardian, described by Dave Simpson as post-rock classical experimentalists. And he criticises Efterklang for not being able to rouse the audience like the band Elbow, which he says triumphed with the Halle in 2009. Efterklang suffers by comparison, and that they're never going to rouse a venue like Guy Garvey can with big crowd-pleasing gestures. Also, another 3-star review by The Guardian's Betty Clark, who says their eclectic style, however, demands space to breathe, and shorter songs like The Living Layer and Dreams Today, which start as a sprint but end up puffed out, are left wanting. And another one, 5 out of 10, from NME John Colvert, described Pyramida as a fusty old thing. The main problem lies in the dearth of choruses and verses. In place of these songwriting basics, we witness the arrival of yet another left-field instrument confusing your palate. Kasper Clausen's beige voice is the anti-fun. Pop vitality is in short supply, and that phrase we'll discuss a bit later. Destined for the obscure, kind of interesting slot come end of year list time. And another review from Matthew Murphy of Pitchfork, 5.7 out of 10. Overall, the album's tug-of-war between the group's lofty conceptual ambitions and the strange aversion to actual musical risk-taking. As a result, Pyramida's impact is a bit like that of an epic but disappointed Hollywood blockbuster. So, these reviews I totally disagree with, but I do understand where they're coming from. And I think it's because Efterklang, they occupy a very rare space in the crossover market. And it's parallel, I believe, to that of the trained classical artists who move into pop music. These are pop musicians who've moved into classical music. So, for example, artists like La Scala, Il Divo, Bond, Andre Rieu, who come from a classical background into the pop crossover, they often receive very mixed to bad reviews from the classical aficionados. And this is something we discussed and looked at in class, but we didn't look at it from the other side of the spectrum. The musicians from the pop side who go into the classical world, and then they get criticised by people in the pop world because they're not doing pop music. So I find that kind of amusing and very interesting. Thus, they lack pop vitality because they've gone into the classical genre. And from a personal perspective, as a classical musician, I find it very interesting how I have a greater affinity to bands such as Efterklang, Bjork or Johnny Greenwood of Radiohead, than to the classical artists like Bond or Ryu. And I kind of believe it's like if an artist ventures into your own medium, and mine is classical music, while bringing their own, it has like a mutual, I don't know, appreciation, rather than someone from my area moving into the pop area. So yeah, and also due to the fact that pop music has a greater and further reaching audience, it's clear that classical artists, the classical crossover artists, achieve greater commercial success than the pop artists who cross over into the classical world. So yeah, however, in my opinion, I don't believe Efterklang's success should be based on commercial success. It's fairly obvious that it's easier to be more commercially viable in the pop industry than in the classical industry. So let's look at some musical characteristics. From the music which I'm about to play you, they have an extensive use of large orchestra with choir, backing vocals, electronics, and pop band. They also use sample and experimental electronic sounds, contemporary orchestration techniques, contemporary orchestral arranging. Interestingly, Pyramida was orchestrated by André de Ridder, who is a classical conductor and arranger, listed on Classical FM's 10 Greatest Indie Crossover Artists of 2014 alongside Nico Mooley and Johnny Greenwood. And it's kind of interesting how they have a classical conductor alongside Mr. Greenwood of Radiohead. There's, an extensive use of orchestra, and it's blended symphonically rather than just a pop band with strings. It's completely blended and unified. There's also an unconventional use of harmony, and very interesting vocal lines, which kind of hint at folk music. And on the pop side, it's very, very progressive music, characterized by a few hooks and very few choruses, which appear sparingly. And often these great progressions build up to just one single climax, orchestral climax, rather than a verse-chorus structure. Traditional indie influenced style band. Without the orchestra, they would sound very much similar to something like Vampire Weekend. Always at least one hook or catchy motif, but it's not the traditional verse-chorus structure. And yes, it does lack the catchy pop sound. However, I believe it stands in great esteem for its merit for not trying to do that. So let's have a listen. Let's listen to Ghost, and you'll hear there's a very interesting use of scales of the harmonic series in the woodwind straight away. Interesting scalic vocal lines, almost jazz sounding, interesting world percussion sound. Harmony is very simple, and you'll hear the contemporary string arranging.
Look at the way you, look at where you are. I've got you stuck. What do you see, my dear? Any help I've got it wrong. You're flicking through your tears. The ghost, the ghost, the ghost, the ghost, the ghost, the ghost that never was. The ghost, the ghost, the ghost, the ghost, the ghost that never was. The ghost.
And let's move on to another song, Apples. He uses. I really like this song. He uses very interesting harmony. It's just parallel chords, but it quickly builds up to symphonic proportions with extensive brass, and also doubled by keyboard. And the blending is really interesting, how quickly it grows.
Another way to your heart. Start to look like seconds, and then we're off. The more you take to yourself, the more you take it away. We'll settle into your feet. Start to look like echoes, and then we're off. The more you want to be said, the words believing the way, all kind of ways, all kind of ways to your garden. Another way until it stays. You gotta hold my hand.
Okay, now finally, the living layer and veil. As you'll hear, it begins sounding very much like a progressive synth pop track or electronica track. It also uses metallic percussion taken from samples. I'll talk about it a bit more from the Pyramidal Island. After 3 minutes, this track subsides, and then it's about 7 minutes of progressive orchestral music, which sounds very similar to Debussy, so it's very interesting.
I'm wandering over the bodies that fell.
So after listening to those 3 tracks, this artist is clearly venturing heavily into the classical realm. So let's look at some aesthetic considerations. Quickly, this is a list of the orchestras that Efterklang has worked with, and some of the places where they've performed. I think this is interesting because in an 11-year career, Efterklang has performed with more orchestras and more classical venues than many pop bands which have had a greater career than them. And I think this characterises Efterklang's crossover position, a band with a sensitive and symphonic proportions, and it's clear that their preferred venue appears to be a more classical environment. and that suits the music. And from my experience, I actually saw Efterklang at Bridgewater Hall, and when I was there, everyone was just sat listening to the music. And if you look at videos on YouTube, everyone is sat quietly enjoying the music. And so it feels more like music which you sit and listen to, like classical music, not music that you would dance or tap your feet to or jump around or something. It's not music you go out and get drunk to and have fun. It's music with contemplation and depth. Yeah, in my opinion, this is what suppresses that pop vitality. But I don't think that's a bad thing. It's just the other side of the fence. These guys, they're venturing into that deeper realm than the commercial realm. So the Pyramida aesthetic from their album. The Pyramida album was influenced by a trip to an abandoned town near the Arctic Circle. Noises and percussion hits and electronic sounds are samples from that exploration. The album is motivated by artistic values rather than commercial values. They're an indie pop group who are exploring, researching and experimenting with real-world sounds, history, interviews and people of the past. With this, they collaborated with a director to produce a documentary about the history of this town, the sounds they collected, and they described it as a treasure hunt for sounds. And their latest venture since then, according to their website, which hasn't come around yet, is that they're supposed to be writing and performing their own opera, again firmly concluding their position as an indie classical crossover artist. Here's a poster. And following the release of fourth album Pyramida, Efterklang add another string to their bow with The Ghost of Pyramida, a film by Danish director Andreas Kofeld. And accompanied by their taciturn and indifferent Russian polar bear guard, the group goes on an audio treasure hunt in the empty buildings of the abandoned town. So it's fair to state that Efterklang are not seeking purely commercial success as a band, but rather taking on more of a research role, searching for sounds, discovering the past and creating music based upon that experience. It's comparable to Scholars. However, they're an indie pop band. Often contemporary classical musicians, composers or scholars would be focusing on this kind of thing, while many pop musicians are searching for commercial success. And it's interesting to see Efterklang absorb these classical qualities or research or scholarship qualities, and it's a complete reversal of the stereotypical roles. The classical musicians who cross over, they often simplify the music or use sex appeal. These guys are actually doing research or experimenting. So to clarify, the album is inspired by research, exploration and experimentation. They focus on creating new sounds and bringing them to both pop and classical audience, and the effect, in my opinion, is dark, haunting, introspective, but at the same time it's very, very sensitive, and I do kind of like that kind of thing. And you can definitely hear these impressions in the music. So yeah, now let's just quickly look at the image of the band. As you can see, it's a very smart appearance which suits the concert hall and the classical artists and fits in with the concert orchestra. Let's quickly look at commercial success. Sellout shows at Sydney Opera House, selection at 4 film festivals for that film I talked about, and they won 2 awards. Their chart success, 8 in the Danish charts, 10 in the UK independent charts, 17 in US Billboard Hot Seekers. Interestingly, Pyramida is their most commercial album, but their least commercial sounding one. I personally feel happy to see indie artists venture into the classical world. As a composer myself, I feel great. It's great to listen to contemporary arranging and the complete modern blend of orchestra and pop. I find it very positive that Efterklang balance the classical and pop side well. They're not just a band with strings. The orchestra is integral to the music. And I think with that in mind, it gives me confidence in my own career. I'd love to work as an arranger on such a project with such liberty. However, I obviously believe it's very rare to find such an artist a pop artist who's so exploratory with their sounds and their experimentation, because it does lack that commercial appeal. And I also feel very positive that a band is basing their music on experimentation of the sound world rather than selling out, so to say, through sex appeal or simplicity. It shows a greater appreciation of the music at risk of losing an audience. And finally, in conclusion, Efterklang's musical style and aesthetic firmly roots them as an indie rock classical crossover artist. Their aesthetic image is a conservative one, and they perform at opera houses with orchestras to seated audiences. And I believe that's a positive thing. It's akin to an audience dancing to an Andre Rieu arrangement at one of his concerts. It's just the other side. And I believe Efterklang occupy a very niche, not very commercial space, but that space does exist, and I enjoy that space, and I'm sure a lot of other people do as well. And in my opinion, they're a great balance between both sides of pop and classical, a style that fits very well together. And thank you very much for listening.